Palace of Mirrors, Season 1, Episode 13, The Wind in the Trees. Night flew toward Darien, like a bird diving out of the sky. The flat of the sword smacked his shoulder. He grunted, but managed to keep his guard up despite the ache. Bluebeard had struck what would have been a killing blow, but he would still take advantage of any opening Darien gave him. Even in death, Darien, you must fight with every fiber of your being. Bluebeard shook his head and clucked his tongue. You pay too much attention to my sword and too little to my body language. Every shift of my weight, every step, every breath, any action I take gives you information on what's going on up here. He pointed to his forehead. In a sword fight, it isn't who is stronger, or even who is faster, that determines the victor. It is who best understands what the other is thinking. The blades, the cries, the blood, it is all a distraction from the battle of wits that really matters. Darien shifted back and forth, keeping himself in the basic defensive stance that Bluebeard had taught him. They sparred in a faded red ring in the middle of a circular exercise room. Equipment filled out the rest of the room. No one on Darien's world had ever needed special equipment to keep in shape. Life took care of that for them. He tried to follow Bluebeard's advice, but the silver of the sword kept drawing his attention. He couldn't stop thinking about the blade slicing into him, splitting his skin like scissors through cloth, and he couldn't stop thinking about Night. Would the blade regret Darien's death? After over 500 years of people passing it by, what did death and loss even mean to the sword? Bluebeard struck Darien's stomach, knocking his breath from his chest. He sagged, gasping and coughing, tears streaming down his face. How the captain managed to hit so hard without so much as nicking the fabric of his shirt mystified Darien. Dull practice swords hung on a rack nearby, but Bluebeard had only laughed when Darien reached for one. You're not listening to me. Darien had to find his breath before he could reply. How can you expect me to watch your feet when there's a sword flying toward my face? Bluebeard smirked and readied his sword. Again. Darien shook his head and sighed. We've been at this all day. I'm not getting any better. Sword fighting all sounded so simple in my aunt's stories. Just a clash of blades before the hero emerged victorious. Bluebeard stroked his beard. Maybe a break is in order after all. He sheathed Night, stepped out of the ring, and tossed a towel to Darien. They sat together on a bench outside the circle. Stories are deceptive. He massaged his leg, a distant expression on his face. The best of them hold the truth, but none of them are true. Not even history. Maybe especially not history. I used to make her tell me stories about the Empire. My favorite were those about Dark Sheldon. I made her tell me those over and over. I know every word of those tales. Bluebeard raised an eyebrow. Dark Sheldon. Do you know what name he goes by on my world? They call him the Destroyer. I'm curious. Why not ask for stories of Admiral Darien Fox? Darien smiled. Oh, I did. His smile faded. But there was something about Dark. He was an outsider. Someone who didn't fit in anywhere. Not even in the Guard. He was someone like me. Bluebeard met Darien's gaze. Still, it was his ship that brought the Empire down. Darien grimaced and rubbed the new bruise blooming on his shoulder. True, but was it his fault? What happened? Or was he just an actor on a stage, and everything was written before he even got there? Bluebeard looked away, and Darien thought maybe the old captain looked to some moment long past. Does it matter whose fault it was? Maybe you're right, and he just happened to be there. Maybe he isn't to blame for all the history that brought him to the moment where Nightingale destroyed Greywind and ended an entire civilization. Nonetheless, his name is a curse now. History made its judgment, fair or not, about who to blame the fall on. I suspect, given a choice, he would have chosen a quiet life to what he got. The world spun about Darien, and he felt in that moment as though he weren't on a starship sailing through the clouds. He could almost smell the earth, could almost feel the hard eyes of his father on him, could almost, but no, he wasn't home. His eyes stung. Bluebeard stepped back into the ring, and Darien had no choice but to join him. The rhythm of the sword fight reminded Darien of Kathy's voice winding its way along the twists and turns of a story. The harmonic tones of the striking blades created a melody, percussive and driving, so like the patter of her voice. Each crash, each step and spin, each attack and each parry followed the beats that Darien knew so well. In his duel with Bluebeard, Darien heard the story of Dark's final battle with Admiral Greatskull, and it had been his voice, not hers, that spoke the words. He felt a certainty. He knew where Bluebeard would strike. He knew how the captain would move. He knew how the fight would go. In that moment, as he saw it all playing out in his mind, Bluebeard moved out of beat. The flat of the blade rang against Darien's skull. He staggered and swore. The taste of blood filled his mouth. He'd bitten down on his tongue. Let me ask you, Darien, do you play any music? A lute, perhaps, or a fiddle? Darien shook his dazed head and immediately regretted it. No. My sister, though, she plays the fiddle. He smiled, despite the splitting pain in his skull. She filled the house with music. Even when the days had grown so dark you almost forgot what a lit sky looked like, she would keep us going. Bluebeard spun and twirled with night, nearly dancing with the blade. He came to a stop, a wide grin across his face. You see, my boy, a sword fight is like a dance set to music. I can see in your movements you've noticed the rhythm, but that's not enough to win a fight. It's the improvisation that separates those who can simply play from those who are true musicians. Your sister, when she played, did it ever grow stale? No. Every time it was like the wind in the trees. The same, and yet different. Bluebeard raised tonight. Aye, lad. Show me the wind in the trees. Darien struggled to track the weeks that passed on the Kraken as he trained under Captain Bluebeard and Gent. During the rare moments he had to himself, Darien rarely returned to his bunk. He couldn't stand the empty room with its dim lights and claustrophobic beds. Most of all, he couldn't abide the goosebumps that appeared on his arms and the chill of the recirculated air blowing out of the vent. They suggested a change happening deeper than the cuts on his skin and the ache in his muscles. No longer could he escape the touch of cold. Some days, he wandered aimlessly. He learned the movements of the other pirates and altered his course so that he never ran afoul of them. He found a sliver of peace as long as he kept his feet moving. In those moments, he remembered the journey he and Tom had taken together. It comforted him to think of his friends safe and far from the sharp edges of the pirate ship. So little time had passed, and yet it felt years since they had parted at the foot of the ancient bridge. When he wasn't wandering, Darien found his way to the engine room. The first time he went hoping to hear the melody again. It remained lodged in his mind, and yet he could never quite grasp the shape of it. He found only silence now, but had grown to appreciate it. If he closed his eyes, he could almost imagine he sat outside his home on a still evening. Once Darien had hated silence. It haunted winter days. He had been desperate for the crackle of fire and for every breath, no matter how slight. Kathy's voice had been his salvation. She spoke, and silence broke. She spoke, and the world came alive with the roar of starship engines, the blast of lasers, and the clash of swords. Now he lived aboard a ship, and he wanted only silence. The door cracked open, and Bluebeard stepped into the room. In the light of the engine, Knight's eyes glittered purple. Darien rushed to stand, but Bluebeard motioned for him to remain sitting. The captain circled the engine slowly. He stopped and knelt, his head bowed and hands clasped. His lips moved silently. With a deep, gasping breath, he stood and faced Darien. "Fine sparring today, truly fine," he smiled. "Who knows? Someday you may even surpass me." Darien's cheeks warmed, the heady taste of pride in the back of his throat. His father had never praised him. Darien always made some mistake. His lines had never been straight enough, and his words had always been the wrong words. Even his dreams had been the wrong dreams. "Gent tells me you spend hours here every day." Darien nodded and opened his mouth to speak. No need to explain. I understand. I can't tell you how much time I've spent here. In the days of old, every space captain meditated in the engine room. Those days have long since passed into memory, and beyond for many, yet I find myself keeping to tradition. He drew Knight with the care of a parent holding a child and peered into the mirror pommel. His rough voice, quiet and out of key, hummed a tune that Darien couldn't place. It sounded reminiscent of the music he had heard the first day he saw the engine. "Do you know, Darien, I often wonder, how is it the past is always right beside us? 500 years have passed, and still I hold to a tradition whose purpose no longer exists. A person can be dead, but still I might hear their voice singing me softly to sleep. I wonder how that can be." Darien used to run out into the first snowfall with his arms stretched out. He would stay out until every inch of exposed skin had turned bright red. Eventually, Kathy, standing at the door with her red hair blowing out like the sun setting behind the clouds, would call him home. Would her voice ever leave him, or would it follow him no matter how far from home he might travel? When he'd lost all other voices, would he still hear hers? Why did captains meditate in the engine room? Bluebeard looked down at Darien a moment, and then up at the engine. "Because, my boy, because the engine of every ship was quarried from beneath the Palace of Mirrors. People used to say that a star engine could whisper with the wisdom of the palace itself." The captain closed his eye and shivered. "I can't say for sure it is true. In all the years I've come here, it has never spoken to me. If ordinary people like you and I are haunted by the past, I wonder what it must be like for the Palace of Mirrors. The histories don't agree on how long it has stood on its cliff above Leviathan, but it has surely been at least a millennium. With the weight of all that history, is it any wonder that it has gone silent?" Darien stood and circled the room until the engine hovered between him and Bluebeard. The captain looked young through the light of the sphere. It erased the lines from his face and brought color to the gray in his beard. Only the eye patch remained to give away the years that had worn themselves on the captain. It swallowed the light, a hole in Bluebeard's face. A line came to Darien then, and it came to his lips without thought. "No one can live on silence alone." Bluebeard laughed quietly. "That's a line from Night Watch. I've not seen that play in a very long time. A very different time. My aunt read it to me once. She had a different voice for every character." A sudden thought, wild and powerful, possessed him. If he touched that sphere, he could see Kathy again. She wouldn't have to be a voice following him, always out of sight. He could hold her again, and she could hold him. What if... He couldn't meet Bluebeard's eye. "What if the palace isn't silent? What if What if it showed me something in the engine? Bluebeard grew still. What are you saying? I think, Darien's voice broke on the words. I think it showed me my world eons ago. Before the Empire, before the palace, before men, before the ravines, and before winter. I saw a rock fall from the sky. I think it shattered Six, made it into my home. What do you... Bluebeard staggered around the engine to face Darien. He no longer looked young. His good eye had become nearly as dark as the patch where the other should be. The hand holding Night shook as Darien had never seen it shake before. Is this your idea of a joke? Did Gent put you up to this? No, You wouldn't be the first to try to take advantage of my beliefs. But if you think you can play me for a fool, you've made a terrible mistake. I won't be lied to. Not on my ship, not here in my engine room. Darien licked his dry lips. I'm not lying. I wouldn't lie to you. Bluebeard looked deep into Darien's eyes and nodded. With a deep breath, he took a step back. A wry smile touched his lips. We both know you would lie to me. You already have. Someday that will catch up with you, but not today. He spun and headed for the door. You've given me much to think on, Darien. Wait, if the palace has been silent for so long, why would it speak to me now? What does it mean? Bluebeard took a deep breath and held it in. As you said, no one can live on silence alone. He sighed. I was desperate once, before I became so old. I had achieved the one great goal of my life, and I thought maybe if I could just hear the palace, it would save me from all I had done. I thought maybe it would save me from myself and everything I had become. I traveled to Leviathan. Even now, 500 years later, it's a world of ash. I listened to the howling wind, a wind more ghost than air, I think. I tasted the bitter soot. His voice dropped to a rough whisper. It still stands. On top of a great cliff, the Palace of Mirrors stands. The walls are cracked, the windows broken, but the building stands, almost as though it waits for life to return. I knelt before it, and I prayed for pity, but I found only silence. Bluebeard limped out of the room. The door boomed behind him. Silence resumed its watch over the room, but Darien realized the quiet no longer comforted him. It lurked in corners the room did not have. With a gasp, Darien fled the engine for the cacophony of the ship. The Kraken sailed down out of the clouds. Wisps of vapor clung to the metal, as though trying to hold the ship in the sky. A village lay on the edge of a ravine below. The houses looked small beside the vast rent in the surface of the moon. They grew larger on the view screen as the Kraken landed, but Darien couldn't shake their vulnerability. It seemed as though at any moment the moon could open its jaws, teeth all sharp rocks, and swallow them into its gullet, dark and darker. He sat at his station on the bridge. He had been assigned to an operations station after Gent decided that he had a basic knowledge of how the ship worked. Bluebeard stood, hands clasped behind his back, in the center of the room. He hadn't moved or spoken since the ship left the cloud cover, when Bluebeard had instructed Darien to inform him if the sensors indicated any other ships. Darien had almost asked why they would bother. They were the only starship on the whole moon, as far as he knew. Bluebeard and Darien were alone on the bridge. The ship landed silently, without even a slight vibration. How much must all that metal weigh? Shouldn't Darien feel it in the soles of his feet when it touched down? Shouldn't he feel it in his heart when they made contact with the world where he had lived his whole life? The rest of the crew, not counting Gent, who was stationed below decks, sauntered out of the ship. The villagers had gathered at a distance and seemed uncertain how to respond to the presence of the dagger at their throat. No sound came from the view screen at the front of the bridge, so they could not hear when the screams began. The farmers of Six did not have swords, which they saw on the whole as foolishly ornate and ceremonial. Many had guns, but they were not fighters. The only war they fought was the war against the seasons and the capriciousness of life. But they were not helpless. No one carved by the snow and ice could be helpless. No one who had lived all their life having never seen the sun could be weak. Only the strong survived on Six. They fought with everything they had, but it was not enough. Fantasia spun and twirled away from a rifle blast. She danced, a perverse inversion of Mariala the night Darien had met her. Swords swept lines of reflected light around the pirate. Her feet slid seamlessly along the ground. Even as the earth beside her exploded, she did not reach for her gun. Her every movement flowed, one to the next, and blood turned the silver arcs of her swords red. Bodies slumped to the earth on either side of her. "Palace above," Darien gasped. Bluebeard shifted, but did not turn away. I never imagined that something so horrible could be so." The words faded from his lips. How could he admit out loud how beautiful he found her? Not in the act of murder, but in the artistry of her movements. She might as well have been the wind given form. "She had mastered the sword even before I found her," said Bluebeard. "I've known few who could truly match her skill." "And you?" Darien scrutinized the captain. "Could you defeat her?" Bluebeard's hands tightened behind his back. "Yes." He sounded weary. The pirates had moved into the village, beyond the view on the screen. Bodies lay strewn. Their arms and legs, twisted and lifeless, splayed out. Their blood painted the moon, and their empty eyes stared into the cloaked sky. Once they had been human. They had toiled in the earth. They had taken shelter from the wind and snow. They had played music. They had held their children in tight arms and smelled the breeze in their hair. They had fought for their families and friends, and they had died. "Why do you do this to us?" Bluebeard did not turn to face Darien when he replied. "It is our nature, Darien. It is who we are." Darien's hands spasmed on his console. "That blood! Those bodies! You don't just get to claim what? That you never had a choice? That you're just killers by nature, and that's that?" Bluebeard did not speak. Say something." Darien stepped away from his station and reached out to grab Bluebeard, but the captain moved in a blur and snatched Darien's wrist. His cold, dark eyes stared into Darien. "What kind of life do you think we've lived? I found Fantasia in the pouring rain. The bodies of her classmates and teachers scattered about her, all because they had the gall to protest against the bastard who had taken their government and turned it into a twisted thing to serve his own needs. The universe has taken everything from us. Can you truly be surprised to find that we're willing to take back from it?" Darien drew his hand back from Bluebeard. "Do you think the universe gave those people any more than it gave you?" Darien motioned to the bodies on the screen. "Believe me, there's not a one of us who hasn't suffered every damned day of our lives." Bluebeard took in a breath. "Aye, I'm sure that's true enough. So stop. Go down there and do something. Don't just stand here watching." Bluebeard shook his head. "Who do you think I am?" He motioned to the screen. "Do you think this is anything compared to what I've done in my life?" His voice quivered. "I don't know what you've done." Bluebeard met that dark eye and did not flinch away. "All I see is what lies outside this ship. All I know is what you do right here, right now." Bluebeard looked away and stepped to the front of the bridge, right up to the screen. For a moment he hunched, as though crumpling under a great weight, but the moment passed, and he drew himself straight. "I'm a pirate." All the softness had been washed from his voice. Only stone remained. Twilight led a line of prisoners to the ship. One woman broke away and fell to her knees over one of the bodies. She wept. Blood soaked her skirt. Fantasia strolled into view and yanked the woman from the corpse. She dragged the woman back to the line. "Don't you see?" Darien whispered. "Don't you understand at all? We're broken. We've got nothing left to give." "Broken?" Bluebeard ran a hand through his beard. "No. I know all too well what it is to be broken. Your people are many things, but I would never describe them as broken. They fetch a high price on the slave markets. They are prized for their resilience and capability." Darien's arm twitched to his sword. He had never been a violent person, and the urge to draw blood sent a cold fear through him. The shock of the emotion stopped his hand short of the sword's hilt. "Those aren't slaves," Darien pointed to the prisoners. "Those are their mothers and fathers and children. They're people. Can't you see? Can't you see those are people?" Bluebeard let out a long breath before replying. "I see them, Darien." He stood poised. "A long time ago I was like you." He laughed quietly. "I might have tried to fight for those people. A long time ago. A very long time ago. I barely recall that boy, the boy I used to be. I see you, and I remember." Darien took a step toward the captain. So let them go. Do what that boy would have done." Bluebeard smiled, a dark edge to his lips. "I haven't been that boy in many years." Fantasia strode onto the bridge. Her sword sat crossed at her back. Worn leather sheaths hid the blades, but Darien knew. All he had to do was look outside to where the bodies lay. He shivered. Fantasia, hair perfectly framing her face, smiled at him. It wasn't a kind smile. It wasn't a smile that promised safety and warmth. If winter had a smile, it would be hers. Still, Darien felt drawn to her. "We've taken 10 slaves." Bluebeard nodded. "We'll not have room for more until we offload on Calypso," he said. "We can't leave this smudge of ice a moment too soon, as far as I'm concerned." Bluebeard sighed. "You know we can't leave. Not yet." Fantasia smiled, like the front of a howling storm. "Are you afraid, old man?" "Yes," said Bluebeard without a pause. "If you had received the same reports I have, you would be frightened as well. This Order of the Sphinx is not some little band of merchant ships. There's something more, something new." Fantasia's smile evaporated. "Nothing frightens me anymore. You know that. Fantasia, you can't." She whirled on him, her hair raging around her face. Her hands reached up towards her swords, quivering. "You're always so desperate to save me, to save me, to save me. When will you learn? There is no redemption waiting for the likes of us." Bluebeard did not reach for Night. Darien realized he had never seen the captain reach in fear or anger for his sword. The old man inched toward Fantasia, but the only emotion in his single eye was compassion. He reached out and put a hand on her shoulder. She shivered, but she did not draw the sword, her hand poised above. "I suppose we're all looking for destruction of one kind or another on this ship," Bluebeard whispered, the smallest of smiles on his face. "But you're a member of my crew, and that means you're mine to look after, mine to try and save, no matter how hopeless that may be." Fantasia shrugged him off and spun out the door. Bluebeard collapsed in his chair, hunched over, his face in his hands. He looked small. He almost looked like a child, lost and confused. I found her that day in the rain. Not a scratch on her, though so many others had died that day. Not a scratch on her skin, but something else. Something no doctor could heal had been carved deep into her soul. That kind of pain, that kind of wound, that was something I knew. I thought maybe I could help her, but she's only fallen further and further away from me. She's a killer. How can you talk about saving her? Did you even see her out there? It's all the rest of us who need to be saved from her. Bluebeard looked up at Darien, a fierceness to his eye. That day, on a muddy street, in the rain, she drew her swords and tried to kill me. Do you know what I thought as we fought? Darien shook his head. I couldn't stop thinking how cold she looked, the water dripping from her hair, her lips blue, her skin so very pale. I couldn't stop thinking how small she was. I couldn't stop thinking. Bluebeard's voice hitched on the words. Couldn't stop thinking she fought with the grace of someone I'd once known and loved. I couldn't stop thinking that she might have been my daughter in a different life, in a better world. Darien felt a moment of sympathy for the captain, but then he remembered Tom weeping in the rain. So you decided to save her by turning her into a pirate? He spoke with the sharpness of sleepless nights, wondering if Mariala lived or died. His eyes stayed Bluebeard's response. For a moment they stood on the bridge regarding one another in silence. Darien spun on his heel and strode through the door. As it closed, Bluebeard called out, but Darien only heard a voice muffled by a cold steel door. Maybe the pirate called out words of violence. Maybe the captain called out an order. Or maybe an old man begged forgiveness of an empty room. Next episode, life on board the Kraken has begun to feel routine. Darien questions his purpose and begins to wonder if he will ever escape the ship. Thank you for listening to Palace of Mirrors. If you like the show, please give it a 5-star rating on your platform of choice and share it with anyone you know who might enjoy it. I truly appreciate it. This podcast was produced, written, and narrated by Matthew Lindquist.